We now know who the star witness is going to be in the case of United States of America versus Donald J. Trump, Waltine Nauta, and now Carlos de Oliveira. Carlos de Oliveira was added as a defendant in the case today in a superseding indictment, which added 9 new criminal charges, some of which apply only to one of the individual defendants. Some apply to all of them. They are all now accused of participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice directed by Donald Trump. The new defendant, Carlos de Oliveira, is a Trump employee working in maintenance at Donald Trump's Florida residence. The 3-person conspiracy described in the superseding indictment tried to recruit a 4th person to the conspiracy. They failed. And because they failed, we now know what really happened in Donald Trump's criminal conspiracy to possess and conceal classified government documents. On page 38 of today's superseding indictment, the purpose of the conspiracy is described. Quote, the purpose of the conspiracy was for Trump to keep classified documents he had taken with him from the White House and to hide and conceal them from a federal grand jury. Donald J. Trump, Waltine Nauta, and Carlos de Oliveira are now charged with participating in that conspiracy, a conspiracy that almost worked until it came up against Trump employee 4. Today's superseding indictment is a story of very willing and eager participation in Donald Trump's criminal conspiracy by some of the lowest level workers in Donald Trump's employ. Walt Nauta does not appear now to be a naive victim of Donald Trump's criminal intent who got caught in an uncomfortable cross current between his boss and the FBI and ended up inadvertently tripping into a charge of lying to the FBI. The superseding indictment describes Walt Nauta as every bit as guilty as Richard Nixon's criminal White House chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, who went to prison for his crimes committed in that Republican White House for that Republican president. Walt Nauta is described in this indictment as an eager, proactive, on-the-ground manager of the conspiracy who lied to people about why he was not joining Donald Trump on a trip so that he could secretly fly from New Jersey to Florida for his most important mission in the conspiracy, deleting the security surveillance video recorded at Mar-a-Lago that shows Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira moving Trump boxes to hide them from the FBI. If Walt Nauta had succeeded in executing Donald Trump's order to delete the security camera footage, then there might be no case of United States of America versus Donald Trump tonight. Security camera footage told the FBI exactly how the conspiracy was carried out, and the only reason the FBI got to see that video is Trump employee 4. The story of the security camera footage begins on page 27 of the superseding indictment with what turned out to be the most important thing that happened on June 3rd, 2022, a year and a half after Donald Trump left the presidency, when the FBI and federal prosecutor Jay Bratt showed up at Mar-a-Lago to collect classified documents that were subpoenaed by a Washington grand jury after the Justice Department concluded a subpoena was the only way to finally get Donald Trump to cooperate and turn over classified documents that he had improperly and illegally taken with him when he left the presidency. Donald Trump's lawyers handed the Justice Department team that day a folder containing what they said in writing were all of the classified documents in Donald Trump's possession. That seemed like the big event of the day, the handover of the documents. But it turns out the big event of the day was, quote, the agents observed that there were surveillance cameras located near the storage room. That simple observation of those surveillance cameras changed history. 19 days later, the Justice Department emailed to a Trump attorney, quote, a draft grand jury subpoena requiring the production of certain security camera footage from the Mar-a-Lago club, including footage from cameras on ground floor basement where the storage room was located. The next day, at 8:46 p.m., Trump called De Oliveira, and they spoke for approximately 24 minutes. So the day after Trump lawyers are told that the Justice Department is going to subpoena the video footage, Donald Trump calls Carlos De Oliveira and speaks to him for 24 minutes. The day after that, the Justice Department emailed the final, actual, real grand jury subpoena, which required the production of any and all surveillance records, videos, images, photographs, and or closed-circuit TV from internal cameras. That same day, at 1:25 p.m., Donald Trump's lawyer spoke with Trump by phone regarding the subpoena for security camera footage. And 2 hours later, Walt Nauta received a text message from a coworker, Trump employee 3, indicating that Trump wanted to see Nauta. And less than 2 hours later, Nauta, who was scheduled to travel with Trump to Illinois the next day, changed his travel schedule and began to make arrangements to go to Palm Beach, Florida instead. Walt Nauta told no one about why he was really going to Florida. He told one person that it was a family emergency. Walt Nauta seemed to know at the time that the reason he was going to Florida was something that had to be kept secret. Later that day, while Walt Nauta was making his plans to go to Florida, Nauta and De Oliveira contacted Trump employee 4, who was the director of information technology at the Mar-a-Lago club. Nauta and De Oliveira exchanged text messages with Trump employee 4, asking if he was going to be around tomorrow, which was a weekend. Trump employee 4 texted Nauta, bro, if you need me, I can get away for a few, just let me know. On Saturday, June 25th, Walt Nauta traveled from New Jersey to Palm Beach, Florida. Carlos De Oliveira told another Trump employee that Nauta was coming down, but he asked that employee not to tell anyone that Nauta was coming down because Nauta wanted the trip to remain secret. Shortly after arriving at Mar-a-Lago the next day, Walt Nauta and Carlos De Oliveira, quote, went to the security guard booth where surveillance video is displayed on monitors, walked with a flashlight through the tunnel where the storage room was located, and observed and pointed out surveillance cameras. The only reason we know that they did that is that the security camera video was not deleted, even though Donald Trump and Walt Nauta and Carlos De Oliveira tried to delete that video in criminal defiance of a federal subpoena for that video. The key element in the conspiracy to delete the video came at 9:48 a.m. Monday morning when Carlos De Oliveira walked to the IT office where Trump employee 4 was working with another employee in the IT department. De Oliveira requested that Trump employee 4 step away from the office so that De Oliveira and Trump employee 4 could talk. All of their movements were recorded on the video that Donald Trump's criminal conspiracy failed to delete. De Oliveira took Trump employee 4 to a small room known as an audio closet near the white and gold ballroom. De Oliveira told Trump employee 4 that their conversation should remain between the two of them. De Oliveira asked Trump employee 4 how many days the server retained footage. Trump employee 4 responded that he believed it was approximately 45 days. De Oliveira told Trump employee 4 that the boss wanted the server deleted. And here was Trump employee 4's moment in history, whether he knew it or not. Trump Employee 4 could eagerly join Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira's apparent eager participation in Donald Trump's criminal conspiracy. Trump Employee 4 could do what the boss wanted, which is what all Trump employees are always supposed to do. In Trump world, it's always about what the boss wants and nothing else. And employees are hired by Donald Trump in the hope and belief that he is hiring and finding the kinds of employees who will do whatever the boss wants, no matter what, whether it is legal or illegal. This was Trump Employee 4's moment. He could make the conspiracy work. He could prevent the FBI from ever knowing the truth about the way the boxes were moved to prevent materials from being handed over to the FBI, subject to a federal subpoena. Trump Employee 4 could commit a crime for the boss or do the right thing. De Oliveira told Trump Employee 4 that the boss wanted the server deleted. Trump Employee 4 responded that he would not know how to do that and that he did not believe that he would have the rights to do that. Trump Employee 4 told De Oliveira that De Oliveira would have to reach out to another employee who was a supervisor of security for Trump's business organization. De Oliveira then insisted to Trump Employee 4 that the boss wanted the server deleted and asked, what are we going to do now? That is the end of that criminal conversation as described in the indictment today. The supervisor of security for Trump's business organization is Matthew Calamari, who has testified to Jack Smith's grand jury. Minutes after that conversation, De Oliveira texted Nauta, who was still in Florida, hey, buddy, are you working today? De Oliveira then called Nauta at 10:15 a.m., and they spoke for approximately 1 minute. The security camera video, which Trump Employee 4 refused to delete, shows De Oliveira walked through the bushes on the northern edge of the Mar-a-Lago Club property to meet with Nauta on the adjacent property, then walked back to the IT office that he had visited that morning, and then walked again through the bushes on the northern edge of the Mar-a-Lago Club property to meet with Nauta on the adjacent property. So there's the video showing Carlos de Oliveira discussing the failed mission to delete the video with Walt Nauta and then walking back to the IT office, presumably to try one more time with Trump Employee 4. A few hours later, Trump called De Oliveira, and they spoke for approximately 3.5 minutes. And that is when Donald Trump no doubt learned that he hired the wrong IT guy at Mar-a-Lago. He hired Trump Employee 4. He hired someone who would not commit the crime that Donald Trump and Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira are now accused of urging him to commit. It didn't matter to Trump Employee 4 that the boss wanted the server deleted, and so Trump Employee 4 is not a co-defendant in the superseding indictment filed in the case today. Trump Employee 4's next appointment with history is when he raises his right hand to take his oath as a star prosecution witness in the case of United States of America versus Donald J. Trump, Waltine Nauta, and Carlos de Oliveira.